Chapter 1. The Body in the Library. The first frost of October had silvered the hedgerows of Little Witchwood, and Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her grey wool shawl, was of the private opinion that nothing in the world smelled quite so honest as wood smoke on a cold morning. She had come to the village, 3 miles and a bus ride from her own St. Mary Mead, to spend a fortnight with her old school friend, Amelia Prynne, who kept a small cottage near the church and an even smaller store of patience for gossip she considered beneath her, though she repeated every word of it faithfully to Miss Marple over the teapot. It was Amelia who brought the news, breathless from her walk to the post office, her hat slightly askew, in a manner that told Miss Marple at once that something extraordinary had occurred. "Jane," she said, setting down her basket, with the deliberate care of a woman who wished to be asked to explain herself, "Sir Edmund Ashcombe is dead. Found this very morning, in his library, by that housekeeper of his, Mrs. Whitfield. They say he'd been dead since the night before." Miss Marple's needles paused over her knitting, though her expression remained as placid as a village pond. "Dead," she repeated. "How very sad. He was not a young man, of course, but I understood from you, Amelia, that his heart had been troubling him for some years." "That's just it," said Amelia, lowering her voice as though the hydrangeas outside the window might overhear. "They're saying it looks as if he fell, struck his head on the fireplace fender, poor man. But the door to the library was locked from the inside, Jane. Locked, with the key still in it. Dr. Fenwick had to send for the gardener to break in through the window." There was a particular silence that fell over Miss Marple at such moments, one that those who knew her well had learned to recognize as the sound of a mind quietly and methodically beginning to work. She resumed her knitting, but her pale blue eyes had taken on the far-away, faintly troubled look of someone recalling an unpleasant fact from a great distance. "How very like poor Colonel Bantry's affair," she murmured, half to herself, "except that this time, I collect, the body did not travel to the scene. The scene, if I have understood you rightly, came to the body." Amelia, who had not the faintest idea what her friend meant, pressed on with the relish of a woman who had saved the best for last. "And that's not all, Jane. Ashcombe Manor is in an uproar. There's his wife, Lady Celia, his second wife, you understand, a good deal younger than he, and his nephew Henry, who's been staying there this past month. And now, if you can credit it, his daughter Vivian has turned up as well, the one he cast off years ago and never spoke of. All of them under one roof. And now the master of the house dead behind a locked door. How very unfortunate," said Miss Marple mildly, "for all concerned, and how very interesting for the rest of us, though I dare say it is wicked of me to think so." She set down her knitting altogether now. "Amelia, dear, I do not suppose you have arranged to call at the manor this afternoon? I have always found that a house in mourning is glad of a little quiet company, and I should so like to pay my respects." Amelia, who understood her friend rather better than she let on, smiled and reached for her hat. The manor itself, when they arrived by way of the winding lane bordered with dripping laurels, struck Miss Marple as a house that had been built by a family with more pride than warmth. Grey stone, mullioned windows, and an air of having withdrawn from the village that surrounded it, rather than belonging to it. A young constable stood uncomfortably at the great oak door, shifting his weight as though he had been told to look official, and had not yet worked out how. It was Nora Whitfield, the housekeeper, who admitted them, a stout woman of some 60 years, with reddened eyes and hands that would not quite keep still. She recognized Amelia at once. Village housekeepers, in Miss Marple's long experience, recognized nearly everyone, and led them, after a moment's hesitation, toward the morning room, where the family had gathered in the peculiar, brittle silence of people who did not yet know how to grieve in front of one another. Miss Marple, entering behind her friend with the unassuming shuffle of an elderly lady, more interested in her tea than in anyone's business, took in the room in a single practised glance. The young widow by the window, dry-eyed and very still, the nephew pacing before the cold hearth, his collar slightly too tight, and, seated apart from the others, a woman near 30 with her father's dark eyes and none of his ease, who looked, Miss Marple thought, less like a mourner than like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house and did not yet dare to leave. "A locked door," Miss Marple said to herself, settling into the chair Nora offered her, and a family that had not gathered together in years, all arrived at once, quite by chance. She smiled faintly at Lady Celia and accepted a cup of tea she did not particularly want, and began, in her quiet way, to listen. The room itself, she thought, told a story of its own, quite apart from the people in it. It was a handsome room, but a cold one, handsome in the manner of a photograph taken a great many years ago, in which the furniture had been arranged with more thought for effect than for comfort, and had never since been permitted to grow disordered by the ordinary business of living. There were no family photographs upon the mantel, she noticed, save a single formal portrait of Sir Edmund himself as a much younger man, standing rather stiffly beside a woman Miss Marple took, from the fashion of her gown, to be his first wife. There was no portrait of any brother, nor of any earlier Ashcombe at all, and Miss Marple, who believed as firmly as she believed anything that an absence could speak a good deal louder than a presence, made a small private note of the fact and said nothing. Lady Celia, she observed, held herself with the particular brittle correctness of a woman who had rehearsed her grief rather than felt it arrive unbidden, while Henry Ashcombe's pacing before the cold hearth had the quality less of sorrow than of a man doing sums in his head and not liking the answer. Only Vivian, sitting apart and silent with her father's dark eyes fixed on nothing in particular, seemed to Miss Marple to be feeling anything at all resembling the ordinary, uncomplicated grief of a daughter, and even that, Miss Marple thought, watching her closely over the rim of her teacup, was tangled through with something that looked very like fear. Chapter 2. Miss Marple Arrives. Dr. Gerald Fenwick was a heavy-set man with kind, tired eyes, and he had the particular weariness of a country doctor who has just lost, in the space of one telephone call, both a patient and an old friend. He found Miss Marple, an hour later, seated alone in the small conservatory that opened off the morning room, apparently absorbed in the Manor's collection of potted ferns. "You'll forgive me, Miss Marple," he said, for Amelia had introduced them properly before slipping off to comfort Nora Whitfield in the kitchen, "if I say I'm glad of a fresh face this afternoon. I have known Edmund Ashcombe for 30 years, and I confess I do not know what to make of this business at all." "I understand you attended him," said Miss Marple gently, "for his heart." "For some years, yes. Angina. Nothing that should have killed him outright, mind. Not without warning. Not without the sort of collapse that leaves a man calling out, or reaching for his pills. But there he was, on the hearthrug, his head against the fender, as though he had simply fallen." Dr. Fenwick shook his head. "I have seen a great many dead men in my time, Miss Marple, and I do not like the look of this one. You examined him yourself?" "Briefly, before the police arrived from the county. I could find no obvious wound beyond the blow to the temple, which might easily have come from the fender, or might not. There will be a post-mortem, of course. Inspector Reeve is on his way from headquarters even now." He hesitated. "I don't mind telling you, Miss Marple, for Amelia assures me you are quite to be trusted in these matters, though I confess I find that an odd thing to say of a lady I have known but half an hour, that I gave Edmund a talking to only last week, about his heart and about certain family matters he had been putting off far too long." Miss Marple's needles, which she had resumed out of long habit, paused delicately. "Family matters? He meant to see his solicitor. Old Hobbs has handled the Ashcombe affairs for 30 years. Knew Edmund's father, in fact. Edmund told me, in this very room, that he intended to change his will before the year was out, and to write to Vivian, his daughter, you understand, whom he had not spoken to in 8 years, and ask her to come home. I believe that is in fact why she is here now. I gather he wrote to her a fortnight ago." Dr. Fenwick sighed. He was not, whatever the village may say of him, an unfeeling man, only a proud one, and pride is a slow poison, Miss Marple. It took him 30 years to think of writing that letter, and now he is dead before he could finish whatever he meant to do about it. And the nephew, Mr. Henry Ashcombe, how did he receive this news, do you suppose, that his uncle intended to alter his will? The doctor's kind face clouded. "I could not say. I was not privileged to that conversation. But I will tell you this much, Miss Marple, since you have the air of a woman who will hear it from someone eventually, and had rather hear it plainly. Henry Ashcombe is not a careful man with money. There has been talk in the village, talk I do not repeat lightly, of debts, cards, and worse. He arrived here a month ago and has shown no particular hurry to leave, which was unlike him, for he and his uncle were never especially close. Outside the conservatory windows, the afternoon was fading into the particular grey dampness of an English autumn evening, and somewhere in the house a door closed with more force than was strictly necessary. Miss Marple, glancing toward the sound, caught sight of Henry Ashcombe crossing the hall beyond, his face set in the particular blankness of a man working very hard to appear composed. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully, half to the doctor and half to the ferns, "whether the library door was always kept locked at night, Dr. Fenwick, or whether that was a new habit of Sir Edmund's. Always, as long as I've known him, he kept his rarest books there, first editions, and a quantity of old family papers besides, and he was particular to a fault about who was let in. He took his cocoa there each night at 10, read for an hour or two, and locked the door behind the last servant to leave. It was as fixed a habit as the striking of the church clock." The doctor frowned. "Nora Whitfield has taken him his cocoa every evening for 20 years. She'll tell you the same." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple, and resumed her knitting with the serene, faintly abstracted air of a woman thinking of nothing at all, an appearance which had, on more than one occasion in the past, proved entirely misleading to those who did not know her well. It was growing dark by the time Amelia came to collect her, and as they walked back down the Laurel Drive under a sky the colour of a bruised plum, Miss Marple was unusually silent, turning over in her mind the small, disconnected facts of the afternoon: a locked door that was locked every night, a will not yet changed, a daughter summoned home after 8 years of silence, a nephew with debts and no particular hurry to leave. They were, she reflected, rather like the scattered pieces of a jigsaw puzzle tipped out upon a table, none of them meaning very much by itself, and all of them, she suspected, meaning a very great deal together. "You are very quiet, Jane," Amelia observed. "I am thinking," said Miss Marple, "that it is a curious thing how very often, in a case of this kind, the truth turns out to be an old one, a great deal older, generally, than the crime itself." She did not explain herself further, and Amelia, wisely, did not ask. Chapter 3. The Family Gathers. Inspector Alan Reeve arrived at Ashcombe Manor the following morning, a lean, methodical man of perhaps 40, with the sort of patient, unhurried manner that had served him well in a county where murders were rare enough that each one was examined with almost embarrassing thoroughness. He had already spoken to the local constable, to Dr. Fenwick, and to the police surgeon who had confirmed what Fenwick had suspected, that Sir Edmund Ashcombe had not died solely of a blow to the head, but that traces of digitalis, far in excess of anything his heart medicine could account for, had been found in his blood. "Poisoned, then," said Reeve to his sergeant, standing in the library where the body had lain, now marked only by a chalked outline and a faint, ugly stain upon the hearthrug, "and made to look like a fall, into the bargain. Whoever did this, Baker, was not a fool." Constable Tom Baker, young and earnest and rather overawed by his sudden proximity to a genuine murder, nodded gravely. "The door was locked, sir, from the inside. Key was in the lock. Old Whitfield had to fetch the gardener and his ladder to get in through the window, and that window's a good 15 feet from the ground, with no ivy nor drainpipe near enough to climb." Reeve walked the length of the room slowly, taking in the tall shelves of leather-bound books, the heavy oak desk, the cold fireplace with its brass fender, now removed for examination. It was, he thought, an old-fashioned sort of room, built in an age when houses like this one had had a great many more secrets than modern architecture generally allowed for. "Family assembled, sir," said Baker. "Solicitors here too. Mr. Hobbs says he has to be present for the reading of the will, on account of it being urgent, what with the death and all." "Then we had better hear what Mr. Hobbs has to say," said Reeve, "before he says it to anyone else." The library, cleared now of its chalk outline covered discreetly with a rug, was pressed into service that same afternoon as the setting for a gathering that Miss Marple, invited by Nora Whitfield on the pretext of returning a borrowed umbrella, was fortunate enough to witness from a chair near the door, where elderly ladies of her sort were generally assumed to be harmless, and were therefore very often forgotten. Mr. Percival Hobbs was a small, precise man with spectacles that caught the light in a manner Miss Marple found faintly disconcerting, as though he were forever peering at some private calculation behind them. He cleared his throat with the air of a man who found the entire proceeding distasteful, and addressed the room. "As you are aware," he began, "Sir Edmund's will, as it presently stands, leaves the bulk of the estate, the manor, its contents, and the greater part of the capital, to his nephew, Mr. Henry Ashcombe, with a life annuity to Lady Celia and certain small bequests to the staff. This is the will, as executed some 6 years ago." He paused, and Miss Marple, watching closely, saw Henry Ashcombe's shoulders relax by the smallest of margins. "However," Hobbs continued, and the room went very still, "Sir Edmund called upon me some 10 days ago and instructed me to draw up a new will, under which the estate would be divided equally between his nephew and his daughter, Miss Vivian Ashcombe, with certain provisions besides regarding certain family matters I am not, at present, at liberty to disclose." "You are not at liberty," Inspector Reeve put in quietly, from where he stood near the window, "or you were instructed not to disclose them." Hobbs's spectacles flashed toward him. "Sir Edmund was very particular, Inspector, that the new will should not be signed, nor its contents made known to the family, until he had spoken to his daughter personally, a conversation which, I understand, had not yet taken place. The new will was never executed. It remains, therefore, a draft only, and has no legal force whatsoever. The old will stands." Henry Ashcombe, who had gone rather pale during the reading, and rather less pale at its conclusion, said, in a voice pitched slightly too loud for the room, "Well, there it is then. I don't see what use it is dragging up drafts and might-have-beens. My uncle's will is what it is." "Quite so," said Hobbs dryly. "Which is, I imagine, Inspector, precisely why the matter interests you." Vivian Ashcombe, who had said nothing throughout the entire proceeding, rose abruptly from her chair by the window, her dark eyes bright with an emotion Miss Marple could not quite name. Grief, perhaps, or something closer to anger. "He wrote to me a fortnight ago," she said, and her voice shook only slightly. "Do you know what he said, Mr. Hobbs? He said there were things I did not know, about my mother, about my own birth, that he ought to have told me years ago, and that he could not die easy until he had. I came here to hear them, and now he is dead, and whatever he meant to tell me has died with him." The silence that followed was, Miss Marple thought, a very particular kind of silence. The kind that falls not because a room has nothing to say, but because it has a great deal too much, and no one present dares to be the first to say it. She glanced, very briefly, at Lady Celia, whose composed face had, for just a moment, betrayed something that might have been fear, and then, more briefly still, at Nora Whitfield, standing near the door with a tea-tray she had quite forgotten she was carrying, her eyes fixed upon Vivian Ashcombe with an expression Miss Marple could only describe, privately, as the look of a woman watching a ghost. "How very sad," Miss Marple murmured to no one in particular, "that a house should keep its secrets so very much longer than the people who made them." Chapter 4. Whispers in the Village. If there was one truth Miss Marple had gathered, in a long lifetime of observing her fellow creatures, it was that a village remembered everything, and forgot nothing, though it might take a very great many years and a great deal of tea to persuade it to say so aloud. The village of Little Witchwood, she soon discovered, was no exception, and its memory, it transpired, reached back rather further than the events of the past 2 days. It was old Mrs. Pettigrew, at the post office, who first mentioned the tower. "You'll not have heard, I dare say, being new to these parts," said Mrs. Pettigrew, weighing out a 1/4 pound of humbugs for Amelia, with the unhurried ceremony of a woman who considered gossip a far more important transaction than commerce. "But there was another death up at the manor. Oh, must be 30 years back now. Sir Edmund's own brother, Mr. Charles Ashcombe, the elder brother, mind, the one as should have had the manor by rights, fell from the old tower stair one night and broke his neck on the stones below." Miss Marple, examining a rack of postcards with every appearance of idle interest, said, "How very tragic, an accident I collect." "So the coroner said," Mrs. Pettigrew allowed, in the tone of a woman who had never entirely believed a coroner in her life, though there was talk, at the time, there's always talk, isn't there, that Mr. Charles and Mr. Edmund had quarrelled that very evening, something dreadful, up and down the drive where half the servants heard it. And within the 12-month, Mr. Edmund had married Charles's own sweetheart, Miss Eleanor Vane as was, and got the manor into the bargain, being the only brother left. Very convenient, some said, though I'm sure I don't like to speak ill of the dead. Of course not, said Miss Marple warmly. And this Miss Eleanor Vane, she became, I collect, Sir Edmund's first wife. Vivian's mother, that's the one, died herself not 2 years after, poor lady, of a fever, they said, though she was never strong after. Mrs. Pettigrew stopped herself with the sudden guilty abruptness of a woman who had said rather more than she intended, and busied herself with the till. After the baby came, Miss Marple finished gently, and Mrs. Pettigrew, caught, gave a small, unhappy nod. There was talk of that too, she admitted low, that the little one, Miss Vivian, as she came rather sooner after the wedding than was quite decent to reckon. But there, that's old scandal, Miss Marple, and none of my affair, nor yours neither, if you'll forgive my saying so. Miss Marple, who forgave a very great deal in the pursuit of useful information, thanked Mrs. Pettigrew warmly for the humbugs, and walked back to Amelia's cottage, turning the little scrap of scandal over in her mind, like a coin she suspected, without yet being able to prove, was counterfeit. That evening, over a supper of cold ham and Amelia's excellent chutney, Miss Marple was unusually thoughtful. "You are doing your sums again, Jane," said Amelia, who had watched her friend perform this particular trick of memory and arithmetic on at least 3 previous occasions, each of them ending, eventually, in an arrest. "What have you got?" "I have a brother who died 30 years ago, falling from a tower after a quarrel," said Miss Marple, "and a sweetheart who married the surviving brother within the year, and a child born, I should judge from what Mrs. Pettigrew was too delicate to say outright, rather closer to that brother's death than to the wedding that followed it. And I have a nephew, this present nephew, Amelia, who stands to inherit everything so long as no new will is signed, and a daughter who was about to be told something her father felt he could not, in conscience, die without telling her." She set down her fork. "It is a very old habit of families such as the Ashcombes, I find, to bury their inconvenient truths rather than resolve them, and a very unfortunate habit besides, for buried things have a way of working themselves back to the surface, generally at the worst possible moment, and generally at a very great cost to whoever happens to be standing nearest when they do." "You think Vivian is not Sir Edmund's daughter at all?" said Amelia, wide-eyed. "You think she's—" "You are very quiet all of a sudden," said Amelia, watching her friend across the supper table with the particular expression of a woman who had learned, over a good many years of friendship, to recognize the exact moment at which idle conversation ceased to be idle. "I have said something, Jane, that has set you thinking. You have said a very great many things, Amelia dear, and I am grateful for every one of them, though I confess it is Mrs. Pettigrew I ought properly to thank, for she is a positive treasury of information, however reluctant she is to admit it." Miss Marple set down her fork and folded her hands upon the table in the manner of a woman about to deliver a small lecture. "It is a curious thing, is it not, how very often the truth of a family sits in plain view for 30 years, worn quite smooth by repetition, until one day a stranger comes along and asks the single question no one in the village had thought to ask, and the whole comfortable arrangement of half-truths comes apart in her hands like wet paper." "I think," said Miss Marple, with the particular gentleness she reserved for observations she was not yet prepared to state as fact, "that it would be very wise indeed for someone to discover exactly how Charles Ashcombe came to fall from that tower 30 years ago, before we trouble ourselves overmuch with how his brother came to die in a locked library last Tuesday. I have found, in my own limited experience, that a house does not generally trouble itself to grow 2 such very similar secrets by pure coincidence." She picked up her knitting once more, her needles catching the lamplight. "And I think, moreover, that Nora Whitfield has been in service at that house a very great deal longer than 20 years, whatever she may have told the good doctor, and that she looked, this afternoon, very much like a woman who has spent 30 years keeping a promise she is beginning, at long last, to regret." Chapter 5. The Locked Door Puzzle. Inspector Reeve, for his part, was not a man inclined to give much weight to 30-year-old scandal when he had a fresh murder and a locked room to account for, and it was to the locked room that he turned his attention the following morning, with Miss Marple, invited this time by the inspector himself, on Dr. Fenwick's rather firm recommendation, observing quietly from the doorway. "The facts, as I have them," said Reeve, standing once more in the library and consulting his notebook, "are these. Sir Edmund retired here at 10 o'clock, as was his habit, taking his cocoa, which Mrs. Whitfield prepared in the kitchen and left on a tray outside the library door, as she had done every night for as long as anyone can remember, Sir Edmund preferring to fetch it in himself, rather than be disturbed by a servant's knock. He locked the door behind him, as he always did. He was not seen alive again. His body was found the following morning at 7:30, when Mrs. Whitfield, receiving no answer to her knock, and finding the door locked and the key in it from the inside, raised the alarm. "And the window?" asked Miss Marple. "Latched from the inside, same as the door, and 15 feet up a smooth stone wall, with no foothold nearer than the old ivy by the east corner, which is a good 20 feet distant, and, in any case, has not been climbed by anything heavier than a squirrel in years, to judge by how it's grown." Reeve tapped his pencil against the sill. "The police surgeon puts the time of death at somewhere between 11 and 1 in the morning, and the cause as a fatal quantity of digitalis, ingested, most probably, given the bitterness of the drug, in that cup of cocoa. The blow to the head came after death, or very near it, most likely as he fell. Which means," said Miss Marple slowly, "that whoever poisoned him did not need to enter this room at all. The poison went in with the cocoa, in the kitchen, or on the tray, long before Sir Edmund ever turned the key." "Just so. Which is a very great deal easier to arrange than climbing walls or picking locks, Miss Marple, and accounts, I think, for a good deal of what looked at first like an impossible crime. There's nothing impossible about poisoning a man's cocoa before he drinks it and locks himself in for the night." Reeve permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. "The mystery, such as it is not how the poison got in. It is who had the opportunity to put it there, and who did. That tray stood on the kitchen table for the better part of 40 minutes before Mrs. Whitfield carried it up," said Reeve. "She was called away to the linen cupboard by Lady Celia during that time, a genuine errand by all accounts, nothing sinister in it, and the kitchen passage was, in consequence, quite unwatched. Anyone in the house might have slipped in and dosed that cup, Miss Marple, and no one the wiser." Miss Marple was silent a moment, her eyes moving thoughtfully about the room, the tall shelves, the cold hearth, the heavy velvet curtains drawn back now to let in the grey morning light, with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had learned, over a great many years, that rooms very often told a story of their own, quite separate from the one their occupants chose to tell. "I wonder, Inspector," she said at last, "whether you have had occasion to examine these shelves very closely. Houses of this age, and this one, I should judge, is a good deal older than its present furnishings suggest, were very often built with certain conveniences, shall we say, for a family that preferred not to use its front stairs for every purpose. A priest's hole, perhaps, in a house so old, or something built later for less pious reasons. I noticed, when I sat here yesterday, that the panelling behind that farthest bookcase does not quite match the grain of the rest, and that there is a very slight draught near the fireplace that one would not expect in a room so carefully shut up for the night." She rose, a little stiffly, and crossed to the shelf in question, running one gloved finger along the join between the panelling and the wall, with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman inspecting a friend's larder for dust. "You will forgive an old woman's fancies, Inspector, but I have always found that houses built before a certain date are a great deal more honest about their secrets than the people who live in them, if one only troubles to look closely enough. A modern house has no need of hidden doors, but a house such as this one, built in an age of recusant priests and smugglers, and a great deal of general untidiness in the law, was very often given rather more ways in and out than its floor plan would suggest to a casual eye. I should be very surprised indeed if this particular room did not have at least one such convenience, and even less surprised to learn that a family so practiced in keeping its own secrets had made rather better use of it over the years than its original builders ever intended. Reeve looked at her with the faint, wary respect of a professional man beginning to suspect that an amateur has noticed something he has not. You think there's a way into this room, Miss Marple, that doesn't run through the door or the window at all. I think, said Miss Marple, with the mild, apologetic manner of a woman offering an opinion on the weather, that it would be very worth your while to find out, not because I believe anyone climbed through it to poison that cocoa, for as you say, that was done a great deal more simply, in the kitchen, before ever the tray reached this room, but because a room with a secret way in and out is a very useful thing indeed for a person who has, afterward, some other reason to visit it unseen, to remove something, perhaps, that they would very much prefer the police did not find. And I cannot help but notice, Inspector, that Sir Edmund kept, by his own solicitor's account, a quantity of old family papers in this very library, papers concerning, perhaps, matters a good deal older and a good deal more dangerous than a will that was never signed. Chapter 6. Old Letters. It was Vivian Ashcombe who came to find Miss Marple 2 days later, walking down to Amelia's cottage in the thin autumn sunshine, with the awkward, unpracticed air of a young woman unaccustomed to asking anyone for help. Mrs. Whitfield told me you'd been kind to her, Vivian said, seated rather stiffly in Amelia's small parlour, her tea untouched before her, and Dr. Fenwick said that you had a talent, Miss Marple, for understanding things other people couldn't make sense of. I don't know why I'm here, except that I can't stay in that house another hour without going quite mad, and there is no one else I can ask. Ask, my dear, said Miss Marple gently, whatever you like. My father wrote to me a fortnight ago, Vivian said, the first letter I'd had from him in 8 years, and he said there were things about my mother and about my own birth that he had kept from me out of pride, and that he could not go on keeping them any longer. He asked me to come home so that he might tell me himself, face to face, rather than trust such things to a letter. She twisted her gloves in her lap. I have thought of nothing else since he died, Miss Marple. What could a man wait 30 years to tell his own daughter and then die before he could say it? Miss Marple, who had a very good notion by now of precisely what Sir Edmund had meant to say, did not answer directly, but asked instead, with the gentle persistence of a woman drawing out a memory rather than an accusation, "Tell me, my dear, what do you remember of your Uncle Charles?" Vivian looked up, startled. "Nothing at all. He died before I was born. A fall, they told me, from the old tower. I never even saw a photograph of him until I was grown. My father kept none in the house. I always thought it strange that he should have loved his brother so little as to banish even his likeness from the walls. Or loved him so much, said Miss Marple, that he could not bear to look at his face each morning over the breakfast table. Grief and guilt, my dear, wear a very similar expression to the untrained eye, and it takes a great deal of living to learn to tell them apart." She paused, choosing her next words with evident care. "Your father called upon his solicitor 10 days before he died, and instructed him to draw up a new will, dividing the estate equally between yourself and your cousin Henry. A very great change, from a will that had, until then, left everything to Henry alone. Does that not strike you as curious, that he should make such a change in the very same fortnight he wrote to summon you home, after 8 years of silence?" "I had not thought of it that way," Vivian admitted slowly. "I had thought only that he wished to be reconciled with me before he died, that his heart was troubling him, and he had grown afraid, perhaps, of dying with old wrongs unmended." "That may very well be a part of it," said Miss Marple. "But I wonder, my dear, whether the wrong he wished to mend was not in fact a very great deal older and a very great deal larger than 8 years of silence between a father and his daughter. I wonder whether what your father intended to tell you, face to face, in this house he had built his whole life around never having to speak of it, was not some small family unkindness, but the truth of how his brother Charles came to fall from that tower 30 years ago, and the truth, perhaps, of whose daughter you truly are." The colour drained slowly from Vivian's face. "You cannot mean, Miss Marple, are you suggesting that my father was not my father at all, that I am Charles's daughter, and not Edmund's?" "I am suggesting nothing, my dear, for I have no proof of anything as yet, only an old woman's noticing that the dates do not sit quite so comfortably together as the village would prefer to believe, and that a man does not generally carry a guilt for 30 years over nothing at all." Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "If it is true, and I stress, my dear, that it is only a possibility, and one I mean to test rather more carefully before I say another word of it to anyone else. Then you will understand, I think, why your father might have waited until he could tell you himself, in his own words, rather than trust a truth of such weight to paper. And you will understand also, I am very much afraid, why there might be a person in that house who had a great deal to lose, and very little time left to lose it in, once it became known that Sir Edmund meant, at long last, to tell the truth. Vivian sat very still for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Henry," she said. "You mean Henry." "I mean," said Miss Marple carefully, "that it would be very wise indeed, my dear, for you to say nothing of this conversation to anyone at the manor, not to Lady Celia, not to Mrs. Whitfield, and above all not to your cousin, until Inspector Reeve and I have had rather more time to gather the sort of proof that a court of law, unlike an old woman with a great deal of experience in village matters, requires, before it will believe anything at all." Chapter 7. The Housekeeper's Secret. Nora Whitfield had served at Ashcombe Manor for 34 years, a fact Miss Marple extracted, over a pot of strong kitchen tea, with rather less difficulty than she had anticipated, for the housekeeper seemed almost relieved to be asked. 34 years, Miss Marple, and I came as a girl of 26, under old Sir John, Mr. Edmund, and Mr. Charles's father. I remember them both as young men, Mr. Charles the elder, and due to have everything, the manor and the name, and Miss Eleanor Vane besides, for they were promised to each other since they were children, near enough. And Mr. Edmund the younger, that had nothing that wasn't his brother's first, and knew it, and smiled about it, though I don't believe, looking back, that he ever once forgave the world for the arrangement of it. And the night Mr. Charles died, Miss Marple asked, very gently, over the rim of her teacup. Nora's hands, wrapped around her own cup, went quite still. "I've never spoken of it, Miss Marple, not in 30 years. Sir Edmund, Mr. Edmund as he was then, came to me the very next morning, before the household was properly up, and he gave me to understand, very plainly, that my place here, and a good deal more besides, a pension he promised me for my old age, depended upon my remembering that I had heard nothing, and seen nothing, the night before. I was young, Miss Marple, and frightened, and I had a mother to keep in the village besides. I said nothing. I have gone on saying nothing for 30 years, though it has sat on my chest some nights, like a stone." "What did you hear, Nora?" Miss Marple's voice was very quiet now, and very kind. "I heard them quarrelling, up by the tower stair, near midnight. Mr. Charles and Mr. Edmund both, and Miss Eleanor's name spoken more than once, and angry. And I heard Mr. Charles say something I've never forgotten, not in 30 years. He said, 'She is carrying my child, Edmund, and you would still stand between us.' And then I heard nothing more but the wind, until the scream. Nora's eyes, when she raised them, were wet. I never saw what happened on that stair, Miss Marple. I swear it before God. I was below, in the passage, and too frightened to go up. But I know what I heard, and I have known for 30 years that Miss Eleanor was already carrying Mr. Charles's child on the night he died, and that the baby that came 7 months later, that Sir Edmund raised as his own and called Vivian, was never his daughter at all, but his brother's." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the particular care of a woman handling a piece of evidence rather than porcelain. "And Sir Edmund married Eleanor Vane within the year, and gave the child his name, and never spoke of his brother again. He loved her, Miss Marple. Miss Eleanor, I mean. He'd loved her long before Mr. Charles ever asked for her, though he'd never said so, being the younger son and having nothing to offer. I think, in his own strange way, he believed he was doing right by them both, giving Eleanor a name for her child, and a home, and never once making the little one feel unwanted, whatever the truth of her birth. He was harder on himself than ever he was on that child, Miss Marple. I've watched him look at her, sometimes, across a room, with a grief in his face I couldn't name till years after, grief for his brother, I came to think, and for what his own jealousy had cost them both. You believe, then, that Sir Edmund pushed his brother from that tower? Nora was silent a long moment. I believe, she said finally, that whatever happened on that stair, Mr. Edmund carried the weight of it every day of his life after, as if his own 2 hands had done it, whether they had or not. And I believe that a man does not carry a weight like that for 30 years, Miss Marple, without it coming due at last. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. When he told me, a fortnight back, that he meant to tell Miss Vivian the truth at last, and change his will to give her her rightful share, for it should have been Mr. Charles's share, by rights, and hers after him, I told him it was 30 years too late for kindness to undo a wrong that size. But he said a thing does not stop being right merely because it comes late, and that he meant to do it whatever it cost him. I did not think, Miss Marple, that it would cost him his very life. Miss Marple was quiet a moment, watching the steam curl from her forgotten tea. You have carried a great deal, Nora, for a great many years, and I do not think it was ever truly your burden to carry in the first place. A frightened girl of 26, given a choice between her livelihood and a truth that was not even, in the strictest sense, hers to tell. I cannot find it in me to judge you for the choice you made, whatever the law might say of it. It is Sir Edmund's silence, and his father's pride before him, that built this house of secrets, brick upon brick, until it very nearly buried the lot of you. That's kindly said, Miss Marple. Kindlier than I've any right to expect, said Nora. But I'll tell you plainly, it hasn't sat easy, watching that child grow up under a name that wasn't rightly hers, and knowing all the while what I knew, and saying nothing. There were nights I very nearly told her myself, when she was younger and used to come sit with me in this kitchen for her supper, before things soured between her and her father. I never had the courage for it. I told myself it wasn't my place. I wonder now whether that was ever anything more than another word for cowardice. Who else in this house knew what Sir Edmund intended to do? Miss Marple asked. Nora's face, which had softened with the telling of her old grief, hardened again into something closer to fear. I don't know for certain, Miss Marple, but I do know that Mr. Henry came to this kitchen the very evening before Sir Edmund died, asking me outright what business his uncle had with the solicitor, and would his own inheritance be touched by it. And I told him, God forgive me, more than I ought to have, for he has a way of asking a question that makes it seem unkind to refuse an answer. I have thought of little else since, Miss Marple, but whether it was my own foolish tongue that cost Sir Edmund his life. Chapter 8. A Second Incident. The news reached Amelia's cottage the following evening in the form of Constable Baker, cycling down the lane at a speed quite unsuited to a man of his usual careful habits, his bicycle skidding on the wet gravel as he called out for Miss Marple before he had properly dismounted. "Begging your pardon, miss, but the inspector sent me. There's been an accident up at the manor. Mrs. Whitfield's been found at the foot of the back stairs, unconscious, and Dr. Fenwick's with her now, and the inspector thought you'd want to know of it directly, given as how you'd been speaking with her." Miss Marple was in her coat and out of the door before Amelia had finished exclaiming, and the two of them made the walk to the manor in a silence broken only by the anxious crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant, mournful call of a wood pigeon settling for the night. They found the household in a state of considerable disorder. Lady Celia hovering pale and useless in the hall, Vivian white-faced by the foot of the stairs where Nora had evidently fallen, and Dr. Fenwick kneeling over the housekeeper with the brisk, professional calm of a man who had seen a great many injuries and was still, privately, very much alarmed by this one. "She'll live, I think," he said quietly as Miss Marple approached, "but she's taken a bad blow to the head, and there's a nasty bruise forming already at the base of her skull that I don't at all like the look of. Not the sort of mark I'd expect from a simple tumble down a flight of stairs, Miss Marple, if you take my meaning." "I take it very well, Doctor," said Miss Marple gravely. "You believe she was struck and pushed rather than that she fell." "I believe it is a possibility I cannot in good conscience rule out," said Fenwick, lowering his voice further still, "and I have said as much to Inspector Reeve already." He glanced up the dim stairwell behind him. "She was found not 10 minutes ago by the second housemaid, who says Mrs. Whitfield had gone up not half an hour before to fetch linen from the box room. A room, Miss Marple, that stands directly above the library." Inspector Reeve, appearing at the top of the stairs with his notebook already in hand, descended to join them, his expression grim. "There's a connecting door in that box room, Miss Marple, behind an old wardrobe that stood against it so long the household had half forgotten it was there. A door that opens onto a narrow stair built into the thickness of the wall, running down behind the library chimney breast to a panel beside the hearth. I found it not an hour ago, on the strength of what you said to me the other morning. and I was on my way to tell Mrs. Whitfield what I'd found when I found her instead, lying at the foot of these stairs. Miss Marple's face, usually so mild, had grown very still. Then I think, Inspector, that Mrs. Whitfield discovered that passage herself. Perhaps she had always known of it, having served in this house so long, and that she went up this evening not merely for linen, but to look at it again. Now that her master was dead, and her old promise of silence, she may have felt, no longer bound her quite so absolutely. And I think that someone else in this house knew that passage a great deal better than any of us yet suspected, and did not care at all to have Mrs. Whitfield poking about it and asking herself questions. You think whoever pushed her also used that passage to poison Sir Edmund's cocoa? No, Inspector. You established very correctly, I think, that the poison went into the cup long before Sir Edmund ever locked his door, in the kitchen or upon the tray, where any member of the household might have reached it. But a locked room is a very useful thing for quite another purpose besides murder, is it not? It is a very useful thing for a person who has, afterward, some urgent reason to enter that room unseen, to search it perhaps, for a paper they are very anxious no one else should find. I think, Inspector, that whoever poisoned that cocoa knew perfectly well of the passage behind the chimney breast, and used it that same night, after Sir Edmund had fallen, to slip into the library, arrange his body by the fender, so that his death might look like an accident, and remove from his desk whatever paper it was he had been keeping there, a paper, perhaps, concerning a will not yet signed, or a truth not yet told. Vivian, who had been listening in white-faced silence from the foot of the stairs, spoke suddenly, her voice tight with a fear she no longer troubled to hide. "Where is Henry?" she asked. "Has anyone seen my cousin this last half-hour?" Lady Celia, who had said very little throughout the whole unhappy evening, pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her composure at last beginning to fray at its careful edges. "He was at dinner," she said, "and excused himself directly after, saying he had letters to write. I did not think to question it. Henry has always kept odd hours, and I confess I have long since given up remarking upon his comings and goings." She glanced toward the stairs, and then quickly away again, as though the sight of Nora's still form troubled her more than she cared to show. "You cannot think, Inspector, that Henry would do such a thing to poor Nora. Whatever his faults, he has never in his life raised a hand against anyone in this house." "I think, Lady Celia," said Inspector Reeve, with the careful, level courtesy of a man determined not to alarm a household further than it was already alarmed, "that it is a good deal too early for any of us to think anything at all with certainty, and a great deal wiser, in the meantime, for every person under this roof to account most exactly for their movements this past hour." He turned to Constable Baker. "Find Mr. Ashcombe, and ask him to join us. Quietly, mind, and with no more fuss than the matter requires." Chapter 9. Behind the Bookshelves. Henry Ashcombe was found, 20 minutes later, in his own bedroom, calmly changing his coat, and if he was startled to find Inspector Reeve and a constable at his door, he concealed it a good deal better than Miss Marple, watching from the passage behind them, judged entirely natural in an innocent man. "I've been here since dinner," he said, a shade too quickly. "Reading. I heard nothing of any accident until this moment, Inspector. I give you my word." "Your word, Mr. Ashcombe," said Reeve evenly, "will need rather more behind it than itself, I'm afraid, given what we have just found in the box room above the library. I wonder whether you would care to explain to me why there is fresh candle wax upon the floor of that passage, and a torn scrap of grey worsted caught upon a nail beside the panel door. Worsted, Mr. Ashcombe, that matches your coat rather more closely than I should like, for your sake." Henry's composure, which had held remarkably well through the reading of the will and 2 days of police questioning, cracked at last, visibly, like ice giving way beneath a boot. "I never touched Nora Whitfield," he said, his voice rising. "I swear it, Reeve. Whatever you think you found, I never laid a hand on the woman. I went up that passage tonight, yes. God help me, yes. But only because I heard she'd been asking questions of that wretched old woman in the village, and I was afraid of what she might have told her, and I meant only to speak to her, to ask her to hold her tongue a little longer. That was all. Hold her tongue about what, Mr. Ashcombe?" Miss Marple's voice, mild and inexorable, cut through the room from the doorway, and Henry's head jerked toward her as though he had entirely forgotten her presence until that moment. For a long moment he said nothing at all, his jaw working, his eyes moving from Miss Marple to the inspector, and back again with the look of a man calculating, very rapidly, exactly how much he could still afford to conceal. "About the will," he said at last, sullenly. "That's all. I didn't want it known, before it need be, that I'd asked her about it. It looks bad. I know that well enough. A man asking after his own inheritance the very week his uncle dies. I never touched the cocoa, Reeve. I never went near that library the night my uncle died. I found that passage only a week ago, poking about in the box room out of idle curiosity. One does, in an old house like this, and I've told no one of it until tonight, when I went up meaning only to speak with Nora. And found her, I collect," said Reeve grimly, "already at the foot of the stairs, and said nothing of it to anyone, and changed your coat, and came up here to wait quietly until someone thought to ask you where you'd been." "I panicked," Henry said, and for the first time there was something almost like genuine wretchedness in his voice. "I found her lying there, and I thought at once how it would look, Reeve. A man found standing over an unconscious woman not a week after his own uncle died, under suspicious circumstances. And I am ashamed to say I lost my nerve and left her there for someone else to find, rather than raise the alarm myself. It is a shabby thing to have done, and I do not defend it. But I did not push her, Inspector. I did not poison my uncle. I have done a great many things in my life I am not proud of, but I am not a murderer." Miss Marple, who had listened to this entire speech with the small, unreadable attentiveness of a woman assembling a great many facts into a shape not yet visible to anyone else in the room, said, quite gently, "Mr. Ashcombe, I wonder whether you would permit me to ask you one further question, quite apart from tonight's unhappy business. When you discovered that passage a week ago, did you also discover where it led, not merely into the library, but beyond it? For I am told these old builders were rarely content with a single hidden stair when a second, and a means of escape besides, could be contrived for the same trouble." Henry stared at her. "There's a second door, yes, at the bottom, past the panel by the library hearth, a low passage running out under the east wall to a folly in the garden. An old summer house nobody's used in years. I found it only by accident, feeling along the stonework in the dark. Why do you ask, Miss Marple?" "Because," said Miss Marple, with the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman watching the last stubborn piece of a puzzle settle at last into its place, "it means that anyone in this house, or, I think we must now allow, Mr. Ashcombe, anyone with reason to visit this house unseen, whether from within it or without, might have come and gone from that library on the night Sir Edmund died, without ever passing a single soul in hall or passage to remark upon it. And that, Inspector, changes a very great deal about who we ought properly to be suspecting." Inspector Reeve, who had listened to this exchange with the particular stillness of a man revising his entire theory of a case in real time, glanced sharply between Miss Marple and the shaken young man before them. "Mr. Ashcombe," he said, "you will oblige me by remaining in this house until I say otherwise, and by keeping a good deal further from Mrs. Whitfield's sick room than you have kept tonight. Whatever the truth of your intentions this evening, you have handled this matter very badly indeed, and I will not pretend I am satisfied with your account of it." Henry said nothing, but the look he gave Miss Marple as she turned to leave, half resentment, half something closer to fear, told her, more plainly than any words could have done, that whatever else remained unproven, she had touched, however lightly, upon a nerve that ran a great deal deeper than a merely awkward encounter in a darkened passage. Chapter 10. The Web Tightens. The next morning found Miss Marple in the garden folly herself, an ivy-choked little summer house of crumbling stucco at the far edge of the east lawn, accompanied by Inspector Reeve and a constable bearing a bicycle lamp against the gloom of the passage they had traced from the library hearth out beneath the old wall. "Cobwebs undisturbed along the greater part of this tunnel, sir," the constable reported, having gone ahead with his lamp, excepting a single clear track down the centre, not 2 foot wide, such as a man walking carefully might leave. "And the folly door itself, rusted quite solid by the look of the hinge, and thick with dust on the outside sill that hasn't been brushed in a 12-month at the least." "Then no one came in from the garden said Reeve, with evident relief. Whatever fears Mr. Ashcombe's talk of a second door might have raised. The passage runs one way only, in practice, from the box room down past the library, and no further than this folly, which nobody has troubled to open from without in a year or more. He glanced at Miss Marple. It rather narrows the field again, doesn't it, to those already within the house that night? It does more than that, I think, Inspector, said Miss Marple, who had been examining, with the particular thoroughness of a woman who had once been rather good at parlour games involving hidden objects, the floor of the little summer-house itself. I wonder whether your men have yet searched the grate in this folly. It has not been used for a fire in years, by the look of that ivy grown half across the flue, and yet, she indicated, with the tip of her furled umbrella, a small heap of pale ash and curling blackened paper visible just within the mouth of the tiny hearth. Reeve knelt at once, and with the careful hands of a man handling evidence rather than rubbish, drew out several charred fragments of paper, their edges crumbling, but a portion of each still legible where the fire had not entirely consumed the ink. The truth of Vivian's birth, which I ought to have, Reeve read aloud, slowly, from one scrap, and then, from another, smaller still. My dear Hobbs, I enclose herewith my instructions regarding the new— He looked up at Miss Marple. This is Sir Edmund's hand. I'd stake my career on it. I've seen enough of his correspondence these past days to know it. Someone burned his private papers here, in this folly, and did it, I should judge, within a day or two of his death, for this ash has not had time to be scattered by the weather. I think, said Miss Marple, that whoever entered the library that night, after Sir Edmund had fallen, did not merely arrange his body to look like an accident. I think they searched his desk, and found there the draft of the new will, and very likely a letter besides, addressed to Vivian, explaining at last the truth Sir Edmund had waited 30 years to tell her, and I think they could not risk burning such papers in the library grate itself, where the ashes might be remarked upon and questioned, and so carried them out through this very passage, to a fire lit here, in a folly nobody has visited in a year, confident that no one would think to look, which tells us the murderer knew this passage a great deal better than a week's acquaintance would allow, said Reeve grimly. Henry Ashcombe told us himself he found it only recently. Henry Ashcombe, said Miss Marple, may have told us the truth about when he found it, Inspector, or he may not. But I think there is a rather simpler question we have neglected to ask, which is not who knew of this passage, but who had access, on the night in question, to a sufficient quantity of digitalis to kill a man already weakened by heart trouble, for that is not, I think, a substance one keeps casually to hand in a gentleman's drawing-room. Reeve consulted his notebook. The police surgeon traced it, in fact, to the manor's own greenhouses. Sir Edmund grew foxglove there among his specimens, quite a quantity of it, dried and stored in the potting shed, for some experiment of his own with the County Horticultural Society. Anyone in the household might have taken it. Anyone, Miss Marple agreed, who knew where it was kept, and who had reason enough, on that particular evening, to slip out to the potting shed rather than remain with the family after dinner. I wonder, Inspector, whether it might not be worth your while to ask the second housemaid, the one who found Mrs. Whitfield last night, whether she recalls seeing any member of the household go out toward the greenhouses on the evening Sir Edmund died. Servants, in my experience, notice a very great deal more than they are ever asked about, and remember it a great deal longer than their employers generally suppose. Reeve closed his notebook with a decisive snap. It is a very great deal of circumstance, Miss Marple, for a case that must, in the end, satisfy a jury and not merely an old lady's intuition, however sound I am beginning to find that intuition. Burned papers, a torn scrap of cloth, a housemaid's memory of dirty hands. None of it, taken singly, would convict a man of anything worse than carelessness. No, Miss Marple agreed, folding her hands in her lap with the placid air of a woman who had, none the less, a very definite notion of how the remaining distance was to be crossed. Which is why, Inspector, I think we must stop gathering the pieces of this puzzle one by one, and instead give the person who assembled them in the first place a reason to show us, quite plainly, that he already knows exactly how they fit together. Chapter 11. The Trap. The housemaid, when found, remembered a great deal more than she had ever been asked about, precisely as Miss Marple had predicted. Yes, she recalled quite clearly seeing Mr. Henry Ashcombe cross the side lawn toward the greenhouses that evening, not long after dinner, and returning some 20 minutes later with his hands quite dirty, which had struck her as odd at the time, though she had thought no more of it until now. And yes, now that the inspector pressed her, she believed she had seen him again, later that same night, slipping in through the garden door, rather later than any respectable hour, though she had not liked to say so before, not wishing to make trouble for the family. It was, Reeve admitted to Miss Marple that evening, a case built very largely upon fragments, a scrap of worsted, a housemaid's recollection, a heap of burned paper in a folly, and a passage that anyone might, in theory, have discovered given time enough. Enough to question him further, certainly, he said, but I should like a good deal more than this before I put a rope round any man's neck, Miss Marple, however strongly I may suspect him. Then I think, Inspector, said Miss Marple, that we must give Mr. Henry Ashcombe a reason to convict himself rather more plainly than a housemaid's memory or a scrap of cloth ever could. She outlined her plan with the same mild, unhurried manner she might have used to suggest a new arrangement for the church flowers, and Reeve, though he protested at first that it was hardly regular procedure, found himself, an hour later, quite unable to think of a better one. The family gathered again in the library the following evening, at Reeve's request, ostensibly to hear a further report upon the investigation, a request none of them, in the circumstances, felt able to refuse. Mr. Hobbs, the solicitor, was present also, at Miss Marple's particular suggestion, seated near the desk with a leather document case upon his knee, that he handled, throughout the proceeding, with a solicitor's habitual and infuriating discretion. I am obliged to inform you, Reeve began when all were assembled, that in the course of our inquiries, a quantity of burned papers was recovered from the garden folly, sufficient, in the opinion of our document examiners, to reconstruct a good part of Sir Edmund's private correspondence regarding his new will, and regarding, Miss Ashcombe, he inclined his head gravely toward Vivian, the truth of your parentage, which I understand your father intended, before his death, to disclose to you himself. A stillness settled over the room, broken only by the small, dry rustle of Mr. Hobbs opening his document case. It happens, the solicitor said, in his precise, unhurried voice, that Sir Edmund, being a careful man in matters of business, whatever his failings elsewhere, left with me a sealed letter some 10 days before his death, to be opened only in the event that the new will was never properly executed. A contingency, he seems, with a foresight I confess I did not credit him with at the time, to have half expected. I have that letter here. I have not yet read it myself, out of respect for the family's wishes, but I am prepared, Inspector, to open it now, if you believe the moment appropriate. It was not, in point of fact, a genuine letter of Sir Edmund's at all. Miss Marple had been quite plain with Hobbs and Reeve, in private, that no such letter existed, the true one having gone up the folly chimney days before, but a careful and entirely fictitious construction of her own devising, intended not to deceive a court, which would never see it, but to deceive, for one crucial moment, a guilty man watching Hobbs's hands with an attention he could not quite disguise. Henry Ashcombe rose so abruptly from his chair that it scraped, loud and ugly, across the floorboards. "This is absurd," he said, his voice too high, too fast. "My uncle left no such letter. He can't have." He stopped himself a half-second too late, the words already hanging in the silent room, and Miss Marple, watching his face with the calm, sorrowful attention of a woman who had hoped, until the very last moment, to be proved wrong, saw the exact instant at which he understood what he had said. "How do you know, Mr. Ashcombe," said Inspector Reeve very quietly, into the silence that followed, "that your uncle left no letter with his solicitor, unless you searched his desk yourself, the night he died, and found there was none to find?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Lady Celia had gone quite white, her hand pressed to the arm of her chair. Vivian sat rigid, her eyes fixed upon her cousin with an expression Miss Marple could not, even now, quite untangle. Grief, perhaps, or something closer to a terrible and unwilling recognition. Mr. Hobbs, for his part, closed his document case with the small, precise click of a man who understood perfectly well that the letter within it, real or otherwise, had already done its work. Henry looked from one face to another, and found, in every one of them, the same quiet certainty, and seemed, in that moment, to understand at last that there was no longer any use in pretending. Chapter 12. The Truth in the Library. For a long moment Henry Ashcombe said nothing at all, standing very still in the centre of the room, with the particular stillness of a man who has, at last, run entirely out of road. Then, quite suddenly, something in him seemed to give way, and he sat down again, heavily, in the chair he had risen from, and put his face in his hands. "I did not mean for him to die," he said, and his voice, when it came, was smaller and younger than anything Miss Marple had yet heard from him. "You must believe that much, whatever else you believe of me. I owed a great deal of money, Inspector, a great deal more than I have ever admitted to anyone in this house, debts of a kind that do not wait patiently to be paid, and I had counted on my uncle's will, the old will, to see me clear of them at last, the moment he died, which the doctors had been telling us for a year or more could not be very far off. And then Nora let slip, that evening in the kitchen, that he meant to change it, to give away half of everything to a daughter he had not spoken to in 8 years, a daughter who was not even, I have since come to understand, truly his own child at all. It seemed to me the grossest injustice, Inspector. It seemed to me that I was being robbed of what should rightly have been mine." "So you took Foxglove from the potting shed," said Reeve, "and put it in his cocoa. I told myself, at first, that I only meant to make him ill, to delay the signing of the new will a little longer, until I could think what else to do." Henry's voice cracked. I did not understand, God help me, how very little margin his heart allowed him. I put in what I believed to be a moderate dose, no more, and went to my room, and told myself I had done nothing so very terrible. And then, near midnight, unable to sleep, I went up through the box room, meaning only to listen at the panel, and reassure myself that he was well enough. And I found him already on the floor, by the fender, and I knew at once, from the stillness of him, that I had killed him. "And so you arranged him to look as though he had fallen," said Miss Marple gently, "and searched his desk while you were about it, and found the draft of the new will, and a letter besides, meant for Vivian, and you took them both away through the passage, and burned them in the folly, believing that if the old will alone remained, no one would ever think to look further." "I could not undo what I had done," Henry said, "but I told myself I could still prevent the rest of it, the will, the letter, the whole ruinous truth of it all coming out and costing me everything besides my uncle's life. I did not think of Nora at all, not until she began asking questions of that woman in the village, and I grew afraid of what she remembered from 30 years ago, and went to speak to her in the box room, only to speak to her, Miss Marple, I swear it. And we quarrelled, and she said she meant to tell the inspector everything she knew, and I—" He stopped, and did not finish the sentence, and did not need to. "You pushed her," said Reeve quietly, "down the stairs, to silence her, exactly as you had poisoned your uncle to prevent him signing a will you could not bear to see him sign." Henry did not answer. He did not need to. Constable Baker, at a small nod from the inspector, stepped forward, and the words that followed were the same words that had been spoken, no doubt, in 100 such rooms before, though Miss Marple, listening to them now, found them no less sorrowful for their familiarity. It was some weeks later, the trees along the manor drive quite bare now, and the first real frost settling silver over the lawns, that Miss Marple came once more to Ashcombe Manor, this time by invitation, to take tea with Vivian, no longer Vivian Ashcombe, precisely, though she had elected, for the present, to keep the only name she had ever known, in the same conservatory where Dr. Fenwick had first told Miss Marple of a proud man's 30-year silence. "Mr. Hobbs tells me the estate is properly mine now," Vivian said, pouring the tea with hands that had grown steadier. Miss Marple thought, in the weeks since her father's death, "Charles Ashcombe's daughter, and Charles Ashcombe's heir, though I never knew him, and never shall now. It is a strange inheritance, Miss Marple, to gain a fortune and a father's name in the very same week one loses the only father one ever knew." "Grief is very rarely a simple matter," said Miss Marple, accepting her cup, "least of all in families such as this one, which have spent so very long mistaking silence for kindness. I think, my dear, that whatever else may be said of Sir Edmund, he loved you a great deal more than his pride ever permitted him to show. and that the truest unkindness in this whole sad business was not his, nor even entirely poor Henry's, but the 30 years of silence that made such desperate and dreadful things seem, to a frightened and covetous man, worth the risk of committing them. Nora Whitfield, quite recovered now, save for a faint scar above her ear that she wore, Miss Marple privately thought, rather like a badge of honour, brought in a fresh plate of scones with the particular briskness of a woman who had, at long last, set down a burden she had carried a very great deal too long. "You'll stay to supper, Miss Marple?" she asked. "The Manor's a good deal quieter now, but I think it a kinder quiet than it's known in 30 years. "I should like that very much," said Miss Marple, and looking about the room, at Vivian, steadier now in her strange new inheritance, at Nora, freed at last from a silence that had cost her so dearly. At the library beyond, its door standing open now to the autumn light, she reflected, not for the first time in a long life spent noticing such things, that the truth, however long buried, generally found its way back to the surface in the end, and that it was very often kinder, in the final accounting, than the silence that had tried so hard to keep it down.